Manish, you are muted.
Yeah, am I audible, Harsh, now? Oh, thank you. Uh, so, good evening and good morning, Professor Friedberg, who is joining us from the US. Uh, it's fantastic to have this session today. I am Manish Dabhade, and I'm the founder
Manish, you
of.
are muted.
Yeah, am I audible, Harsh, now? Thank you. Uh, yeah, am I audible? Yes, oh, there seems to be some technical glitch. Okay, let me begin again. Namaskar and good evening to all joining us today. I'm Manish Dabhade and I'm the founder of the Indian Futures. Let me at the outset introduce the Indian Futures very briefly, especially for Professor Friedberg, who joins us for the first time. So, we are a New Delhi based independent organization, an idea startup, that's what we call ourselves these days, that started out in January 2016 with the sole aim of creating a global platform to plainly and dispassionately discuss, in the truest ancient Indian tradition of a samvad, a dialogue, the ideas of New India in all their varied dimensions and manifestations. We are extremely proud to have recently hosted some of India's finest minds from the world of government, politics, academia, diplomacy, and culture. Please follow us on our social media: Facebook, Twitter, Insta, YouTube, at the rate Indian Futures, and feel free to share today's event with hashtag TIF Book Track. We would welcome that for sure. As I said, we are already live streaming this session on our YouTube channel. So, without further ado, let me kickstart today's session on Professor Aaron Friedberg's Getting China Wrong, published by Polity in March this year. Professor Aaron Friedberg is a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. Over the past 2 decades, he has written numerous books and articles warning of the dangers of intensifying economic, military, and ideological rivalry between China and the West, including very famously in his book A Contest for Supremacy, China, America, and the Struggle for Mastery in Asia. He, in fact, also, other than the other books he has written on this book, specially, uh, he has got many, many glowing reviews. And in fact, I'm seeing Professor Friedberg being hosted by who's who in DC and beyond. But one review I found which really stood out for me by my favorite author, James Mann, who's the author of the China Fantasy and About Face, a history of America's curious relationship with China, where, and I quote him, this groundbreaking book chronicles the many misperceptions that American leaders have held about China in recent decades and subjects them to withering scrutiny, an important milestone in redirecting American thinking about China, unquote. I think this, in a sense, captures the power of this book and Professor Friedberg's ideas. So, thank you, Professor, for really taking time out and joining us early morning from the States. Uh, we are also extremely delighted to have with us Ambassador Arvind Gupta. Namaskar, sir, who is the director of Vivekananda International Foundation, one of India's most reputed think tanks, and he has also been the former director of Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses. Various books. He is one of India's respected strategic minds, known globally, and he has been extremely encouraging and, in fact, mentored us at the Indian Futures in many ways. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us today evening. Uh, as always, I'm also delighted to have my dear friend and Professor Harsh Pant, who is also one of India's top strategic minds. He's a professor at King's College London and vice president at ORF, a prolific author with several books and articles to his credit. So thanks, Harsh. So I'm just being very graphic in the introductions. So without further ado, let me hand over the floor to Professor Friedberg to tell us what exactly was in his mind when he wrote his book, and what sort of key arguments he's putting for all of us to see. What do you, sir?
Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. Manish, it's good to see you and to meet you. Ambassador Pant, it's good to see you as well. I look forward to speaking with you. I thought I would take a few minutes to try to sum up the main arguments of the book. But first, let me say a word about the motivation or the reasons for writing the book. I think, like many people in the United States, in the West, I've been trying to understand what I've come to think of as a great reversal in fortunes that's occurred over the last 30 years. And so the question is, how did we get from the end of history euphoria at the conclusion of the Cold War to what I think is now pretty clearly a new Cold War? And this book attempts to deal with one part of that story, albeit a large and critically important one, and that is the emergence of China as a potentially dangerous challenger, not only to the United States and to the West, but to other countries as well, including India. I believe that this outcome reflects a failure of the US and wider Western policy of engagement, and especially essentially unrestricted or unconstrained economic engagement with China. But contrary to how this is sometimes portrayed in retrospect, I don't think this is purely a product of naivete or greed, although there were plenty of those things to go around. In my view, the policy of engagement was the product of a unique set of factors that came together at the end of the Cold War. And basically, and here I'm speaking primarily of the United States, although I think something similar applies to the other advanced industrial democracies of the West, basically a mix of interest and ideology, but one in which the ideological elements, in fact, have played a decisive role. So certainly growing influence of various industries and interest groups that benefited or hoped to benefit from increasing trade and investment with China. Those interests were and remain important, but these material interests were bolstered and I think legitimized by a set of widely held and essentially liberal beliefs that trade is conducive to peace, that economic growth promotes democracy. And I think, especially in the case of the United States, the conviction in the minds of American policymakers that with the end of the Cold War, the moment had finally come to complete the construction of a truly global, integrated, liberal international order, one which would expand the scope of what was, as of the end of the Cold War, a partial and geographically limited economic and political system of liberal states to finally encompass virtually the entire planet, including the states of the former Soviet Union, but also at the other end of Eurasia, China. As regards China, the advocates of engagement argued that it would have three beneficial effects. First, that by welcoming China into the existing international system, the United States and other countries could encourage its leaders to see their interests as lying in the maintenance of that system, rather than imposing any challenge to it or seeking to overthrow it. So in short, the aim was to encourage China to become a status quo power, or as the people in the George W. Bush administration termed it, a responsible stakeholder in the existing order. Second, there was a widespread and I think powerful belief that as China was drawn into what was becoming a truly global international economic system, it would be compelled to liberalize its own economy. That as it was exposed more to the pressures of international competition, as it opened itself to international investment, it would move further and further down the path away from communism, away from state-directed economic development, towards a system that would more and more closely resemble those of advanced industrial democracies of the West, essentially one in which the market played the overwhelmingly dominant role in determining the allocation of scarce resources. And third, and finally, there was a widespread belief expressed by top political leaders in this country, and I think also in other countries in the West as well, that this process of engagement through various means would encourage the eventual political liberalization of China, that over time, China's leaders would see the wisdom of ceding some portion of their power, and China would become increasingly open and increasingly democratic. So the advocates of engagement understood that their preferred policy would help China grow richer and stronger, but they also believed that it would not pose a threat, wouldn't pose a threat to the prosperity, security, and values of the United States and its democratic allies, because over time, the process of engagement would transform it. And as has become, I think, increasingly obvious in recent years, none of these things has come to pass. None of these expectations has been met. Instead, to the contrary, China is not a status quo power. I think it's become an increasingly open and obvious revisionist power that seeks to change various elements of the international order, both in its own region and globally. And its behavior has become increasingly assertive and even in some respects aggressive. So that expectation was not met. As far as the liberalization of its economic system, instead of moving steadily towards a more market-based economy, certainly in the last 10 years, and I would argue it's even longer than that, China has shifted towards greater reliance on mercantilist, state-directed, market-distorting trade and industrial policies to promote and sustain its economic growth, and in an effort to achieve technological superiority over the West. And third, and finally, regarding the liberalization of its political system, obviously this has not happened. China is, by any measure, more repressive than it was 20 years ago, and some have argued that it's more repressive than at any time since the Cultural Revolution. So comparing expectations with results, it seems clear that by any reasonable definition of the word, engagement has failed. And so then the question becomes, why and how did this happen? And the short answer to the question is that the short answer to the question of why US and Western strategy failed is that over the course of the last 30 years, China's Communist Party rulers have devised and adapted a counter strategy of their own for defeating this strategy, thereby enabling them to advance towards their own objectives, which I think have consistently been first and foremost to preserve the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly on domestic political power, and second, to take advantage of the opportunities afforded by engagement to build up China's economy and all the elements of what Chinese strategists refer to as their comprehensive national power, including their military capabilities, so that third, in time, they could begin to use that power to reshape key aspects of the prevailing post-Cold War international order. First, regaining preponderance in Eastern Eurasia, and also, and this I think has become increasingly evident, to establish China as a truly global power on par with and eventually superior to the United States. In sum, Western observers and policymakers got China wrong because they underestimated the resilience, the resourcefulness, and the ruthlessness of the Chinese Communist Party. And the central chapters of my book describe these three dimensions of CCP policy: how it was that they were able to maintain domestic political control over the last 30 years, why their economic policies have evolved in the ways that they have towards this greater reliance on statism, and why it is that they have begun to behave more assertively in the external domain. And I'd be happy to discuss these at greater length, but for the moment, let me just make a few general observations. Over the past 30 years, and I would argue even longer, over the past half century, and indeed back to the founding of the People's Republic, China's leaders have been remarkably consistent in their objectives, but highly flexible in the means with which they've pursued them. And this is in marked contrast to the United States and other Western powers, which have tended to be rigid with respect both to their objectives and their policies. They've tended to cling until very recently to forlorn hopes and failed policies. The troubling trends in Beijing's behavior that have become unmistakable in the past decade under Xi Jinping actually have their origins a good bit earlier, in the first decade of the 21st century. In other words, these developments are not, as they are sometimes portrayed, the handiwork of one man, but instead they appear to reflect a broad consensus among the CCP's top leaders about what's necessary to meet changing conditions. Xi Jinping is a convenient villain. People sometimes say that if not for him, China would have continued on a path perhaps towards reform and liberalization. But I don't believe that's true. I think that it's the system of which Xi is a part, rather than the man himself, that's the root cause of our problems with the People's Republic. Finally, in each domain, political, economic, and strategic, recognition of what was happening has been delayed by the prevailing misconceptions and stubborn expectations that I've briefly described, prevailing in the liberal democratic West. The belief that a determined Leninist regime would somehow eventually permit multi-party democracy to take root and would permit a true market-driven economy to emerge. And the belief that the People's Republic would be content to become little more than a member in good standing of a US-led international system, one whose principles, in fact, are inimical to the legitimacy and potentially the survival of the CCP. So these were mistaken ideas, but they were ideas that people held on to for quite a long time. The concluding chapter of the book digs more deeply into the question of why it's taken so long for the United States and other Western countries to acknowledge the failure of the policies that they've been pursuing for the past 30 years, because I think that's something of a historical puzzle. One puzzle is, why did they follow those policies initially? And then the other is, why did they stick to them as long as they did? And then I suppose the third one is, why have they begun to change when and how they have? And I also offer some prescriptions for the future. And again, I'd be happy to discuss those if people are interested. But my overarching conclusion is that the United States and other democratic countries have to begin by acknowledging, as happened after the First and Second World Wars, that so also in the wake of the Cold War, these efforts to create an integrated and truly global, all-encompassing liberal international order have failed. But I would say, instead of abandoning that project altogether, what they need to do is to fall back to a more defensible positions, to redraw the perimeters and strengthen the boundaries of a geographically limited liberal international subsystem encompassing democracies in Europe, Asia, and North America, from which they can better promote their interests, protect their common values, much as they did during the Cold War. And there will be differences, obviously, but I think there are also similarities. So in short, from an American perspective, I would say we need to avoid the mistakes of the 1920s and 1930s, when the United States, in its disappointment at the failure to create a liberal order at Versailles at the end of the First World War, lapsed into isolationism, and instead to relearn the constructive lessons of the 1940s and the 1950s. So that's a very brief overview, and I'll be very interested to hear people's thoughts.
Thank you, Professor Friedberg. I think you superbly pointed out, highlighted three facets, three larger points you are making in the book about looking at past 30 years, or in fact, you say going back a bit more, how in fact was China looking at the US primarily. I think this is the major point you're saying. And the other part obviously is very important, in fact, component of the book is why engagement failed in the first place. So, and you rightly pointed out, in fact, many would now seem to be agreeing that ultimately it was really the 3 R's you talk about. Those were underestimated, the CCP's resilience, resourcefulness, and the ruthlessness. I think that these are extremely valid points. And again, you're not stopping at that. You're also saying that you're giving out really some very important policy prescriptions, which the American decision makers have to really keep in mind when they look at China in the policy relevant future. So let me now thank you so much. I mean, for this really, I think hitting the nail on the head in that sense, that you really laying out what exactly are the principal debates and how we should be looking at them. So thank you, Professor Friedberg. With this, I now invite Ambassador Arvind Gupta to respond to, the book and the key arguments made by Professor Friedberg. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Manish, and thank you all the other people who are here to in this discussion. And we have just heard a capsule presentation of Professor Aaron Friedberg's book. But I did a speed reading of the book over the last 24 hours, and I must say that it was a gripping account of the failure of engagement, which he talks about in the book. And I could perhaps agree with almost everything that he has written in the book. Not because I'm being fair to the author, but this has been my long-standing view. And in, I think, Friedberg's own words, that China has been deceiving the West for a long time, and they are very good at counter-deception as well. And there is a lot in the book that has happened. And the naivete, I would say, of the political leaders and who were supported by the whole lot of elites, including the businesses. I think businesses have played an extremely important role in this, and quite often they prevailed over the advice of military and intelligence communities. So that is all comes out in the book. And I think the book is also coming from an academician. Every chapter is beautifully footnoted, and there is very good references, so it's excellent for researchers. So all the period that he has covered from mostly from the end of the Cold War to this, and of course some background to the earlier era, it comes out very nicely, and to that extent it's also a learning experience. When I read the book, there were two motivations why I read the book almost, although it's a speed reading, but I think I've got the hang of the key arguments. One is, it's not that West got China wrong, but how did they get China so wrong? This has been something that I've been wondering. And I think some answers are there in the book, but and it also speaks a lot about the strategic community and the community of strategic thinkers about in the US. Is it that there is a certain herd mentality which often happens in our discipline, and the voices like Aaron Friedberg, or that of Michael Pillsbury, who also wrote a similar book, 100-Year Marathon, some years ago, and maybe there are some others also, are ignored. And of course, Michael Pillsbury is a mea culpa. In fact, he said that he was a part of the system, and he engaged with the Chinese, and he discovered that they had the secret plans of emerging as primary power and undoing the US supremacy, etc. And even after he wrote the book, which got rave reviews and so on and so forth, including, I believe, calls from the White House, and yet I think the West more or less continued with those policies. So that answer as to why did they get it so wrong is still, I think, not fully, to my mind, fully answered in the book. And I think one reason is that a lot of the analysis, etc., was so self-centered and self-serving in the West. I mean, they didn't have to go very fast. You see, China plays a long game. I think Aaron Friedberg would know, and China plays a long game, as do many other countries. And China has a long civilization. I think the civilizational aspect of China and Chinese thinking and the Chinese system probably were not given due attention. So there was a lot of academic analysis, but it was not brought into policy analysis. That's probably one feeling. If you had looked back to 1949, when the Chinese took over Tibet, or in 1962, the West is feeling betrayed now, but in 1962, India faced the great betrayal. So much so that the diplomatic relations with China was broken off, and in only 1976, that these relations were restored. And from 1976 to 1995, we had, normalization and some kind of discussions on the boundary, all inconclusive. then some agreements on management of boundary, and then some experience of managing the boundary, etc. Till we had 2020, which is another betrayal. And now we are in a new normal, which is no normal at all. I mean, it is not a normalization. Now, if the West had looked at the experience of India, they would have understood what China is all about. But they did not do so. When China was betraying India in the 60s, the West was opening up to China, and with the help of Pakistan, and you had the normalization, the great Nixon, Kissinger, etc. But the Chinese behavior to its neighbors was simply not taken on. Look at even Russia. The Chinese, the way the Chinese used Russia, then broke off from Russia, and now they are back. Russia-China thing is back again, the strategic partnership. And I think West has to look at that also. How is it that knowing what China is, now that your book sort of lays it bare, and it's very well argued, and yet we find that the Western policies are designed and fashioned to deliberately push Russia. I mean, I'm not a defender of Russia and what they have done in Ukraine, etc. It's deeply troubling. But on a geopolitical sense, how is it that Yeltsin and Putin, who at one point of time were very keen to deal with the West, and they had some, I believe, some ideas about how to create a security architecture, West totally spurned them. And as a result, you push Russia into China. And now how do you deal with China? So this has with Russia and China coming together. And of course, even today, for the West, I don't think China is number one priority. It is now, after Ukraine particularly, it is once again Russia. And Russia, of course, is Putin is now seeing it as an existential struggle, etc. So I think what you have argued about China, now people would argue whether how serious the US particularly will remain about China. So I think that is one problem that I still see in the Western analysis, that they are not taking a long-term view of China. You will have to be prepared, even if it's an ideological struggle. And I have some questions about this ideological struggle, democracies versus non-democracies. Probably that is not the way to frame this new Cold War, as you are saying, because that will not take this very far. See, the problem is, irrespective of what China and Russia are doing, there are some deeply troubling issues about the liberal international order itself, because it has only been international order for the US and its partners, so-called democratic. It leaves out the global South almost completely. And today, China has utilized those the spaces, the liberal international order, which the West established after the Second World War, first due to the Cold War, and now this is the Second Cold War, and in between due to a lot of confusions and a lot of, I think, self-serving arguments and so on. The liberal space has been, left for China to exploit. Not that they are liberal, but they're exploiting it. As you yourself remark in the book, that the West should have something positive to give to the global South. The relationship between the so-called liberal democracies and the global South are completely broken, totally broken. Whether it is a question of the commons, I think they're completely broken. The promises that were kept on which they had to deliver, particularly on climate change, etc., no delivery and so on. And of course, there has been a series of interventions, and the way the West has dealt with the West Asia, the way it has dealt with Iraq, Iran, etc. There are many, many questions. And the result today is that even if you frame this new Cold War as a struggle between the democracies and China, that way you are limiting yourself. And I think you do mention in your book limiting the geographical boundaries to where the liberal democracies are. But you yourself note in the book that liberal democracies are completely fragmented today. There are doubts and suspicions and misapprehensions in the US partners, whether it is Japan, whether it is in South Korea, and even Taiwan. I mean, the latest, I think this Nancy Pelosi visit and the overreaction which China displayed after that visit should have been a good occasion for the US to be more firm. But that didn't happen. And the China is emerged as probably a gainer of this because they have flexed their muscle and they've not gone so far to provoke. And they will continue with what they have to do. The party congress soon will be over. I think she will probably harden his positions, etc. So I think this was the second reason I read the book as to how to deal with China. We are feeling the pressure. US is not on the border of China. US has global interests, regional interests, etc. Whereas we have a 4,000 kilometer long border with China. We are facing their heat. And I find that there is hardly any discussion in the West on what happened at Galwan and how, even in the Quad, the framework, we are only talking about maritime security, whereas China is not just about maritime. The West has deliberately, particularly after Afghanistan, has left the whole field open to Eurasia. Now, can the West ever deal with China by leaving the field open in Eurasia to Russia and China and Russia-China combined there? But India being in the SU, etc., probably can be one counterweight to this. But your relationship with Iran are so fraught. Relationship with Saudi Arabia are fraught. The West, the Gulf countries are today no longer listening to the US on the oil and the oil prices and so on. We are heading into probably a recession or a stagflation. And I think China, to that extent, has concluded the West is weakening and West is unable to get its act together. And I think some arguments in your book also tend to show that this is not a wrong conclusion, that today West is not able to put its act together. So I was reading this book from this point because in India also there is this debate as to how to deal with China. And of course, the way we deal with China will be different from the way you deal with China, although there can be some commonalities. And of course, Quad represents one of those commonalities, but Quad is a very small answer. So while I feel that, yes, the US still remains perhaps the most important country because of its considerable economic, military, political power, etc., etc. But it has to get its act together. And I don't think the strategies which you have suggested, which is actually, you have suggested containment, partial disengagement, decoupling, mobilization, counter narratives. These are some of the strategies that you have suggested. And this is on the assumption that the Western democracies will come together and follow a common approach. But you also seem to be doubting that the way the Western democracies today are fragmented, the way the economy, you see, the globalization experiment is over. It is all the supply chains, globalization was about China. Globalization was about bringing China and getting all the supply chains through China. That experiment is now over. The alternative supply chains are not there. And the new methods, the new technologies, etc., whether it is EVs or whether it is solar or renewable energy, etc., the resources are, the supply chains are still passing through China. Dependence on China is not going to reduce. And the great American and Western companies, they are going to, I don't see any, lessening of dependence on China for, the raw materials or the processing, etc. So, and the West is showing no urgency to discover alternative supply chains. Africa has also been left to China. Africa is rich in many of these minerals and so on. But Africa, given its own colonial past, given its own problems of internal disturbances and now terrorism, and also the China's growth and so on, and the way the infrastructure is being built, I think West has not come out with any such strategy. Latin America, again, with the return of Lula and what's happening in Venezuela, and the disarray in the Caribbean and so on, again, West doesn't seem to have any strategy. Europe is, unless there is a modus operandi with Russia, Europe will remain destabilized. West Asia, which is again at one point of time close relationship, but I think after 9/11 the whole situation is completely changed. Japan, so that leaves very few countries with some capacity with which the US can put together a strategy, but that strategy is going to be limited. So my suggestion would be, first, that there should be a greater dialogue between and a dialogue of listening, not always, telling what to do, because international liberal order was about telling what is the universality of the Western values and how it will be good, the democracy, the markets, etc. Democracy markets, there are grades and there are shades, and I think the West will have to accept that and have a dialogue. And keeping China challenge in the focus and not, shaping it as an ideological struggle. Because moment you frame the whole a new Cold War in ideological concepts and categories, you will alienate and isolate many countries who do not measure up to so-called the human rights standards of the West, which are self-proclaimed, etc. I think so. That is one way to look at it. How to deal with China? You'll have to build a broader community. I mean, what China is talking about. You have mentioned this in, I think it's called CCD, Community of Common Destiny. I suppose that is the word. Something similar, I suppose, the West also will have to do to build a proper narrative, but backed by a lot of resources. The West has been very stingy with its resources because you left the distribution of resources to the markets. And globalization was not really the best way to redistribute resources. And there is so much inequality in the West, and so much of harm that has been done to the global commons thanks to the globalization, etc. So we will have to rethink. And I think here countries like India, which are now on the cusp of a rise of their own, were looking for a narrative in which their own civilizational values could also be expressed, and which is essentially, again, very much pro-engagement, very much against, very, very much pro-inclusiveness, in which the entire global South is there, and very much pro-everybody's rise, pro-equality. I think these are some of the, but somehow these things are never picked up in the strategic discourses and analysis of the West. As a result, the book suggests a new strategy, but I think it all brings back more or less the older notions into play. But as you yourself have said several places in the book, old thinking will not result in new ideas. So to dealing with China, I think we'll have to shed past of our old thinking. And your framework is the Wilsonian one, and then later on, after the Second World War. But I think, Huntington, he also gave an alternative framework to look at the world, and which was the civilizational contest. And I think in India, this kind of a thing resonates, because India is an old civilization. And I'm sure there are many less developed countries, but still very old civilizations. Many of them are in Africa. I think we'll have to rediscover our past. So the West will also first have to, yes, you can do some geopolitical moves, and you can do some, pivots and so on. You can also do some counterbalancing, build military power and alternative supply chains, etc. This is all very good. But I think where is that alternative narrative which is acceptable? The multilateralism which the West itself architected is today, the West is the first to abandon that multilateralism. Today you have West has abandoned the the UN, and given it to the Chinese. And you yourself notice in your book that the Chinese have placed their own people there. So I think we need to discover multilateralism in a new shape, and which takes everyone together. The West never had that, motivation to take everybody together. In India, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, world is a family, that there should be no damage to the environment, etc. These are all civilizational values. The West needs to sit with such countries like India and see whether we can build a new narrative which can counter the Chinese. And I entirely 100% agree with you. China is not going to change. Your central conclusion that it is a Chinese Communist Party, it is the Leninist core of the party, and she is just a continuation of that, is 100% right. And I'll just end with one more thought, and we can discuss this later. I think I also agree with your conclusion that China is perhaps overrated. And she is already in trouble in various ways. And the West has several tools, and the economic tool is certainly one. And I think if clear messages, rather than making some grand strategies, even a clear message, for instance, abandonment or even a hint of abandonment of one China policy, if it comes from the US, and by supporting Taiwan, and by telling some other countries also to abandon one China policy and take the consequences. Of course, there will be some consequences. But as you yourself observe in the book, the Chinese strategy planners, etc., are not ready for a war as yet. They are seeing what's happening. The way Russia is going to now bleed, the way the supply chains will be disrupted. The Chinese have reacted by abandoning their hide your strengths and bide your time strategy. They have, I think, acted prematurely. And this is where I think the chance comes. And in the next one decade, say about 10 years, if a few economic policies, few military policies, few diplomatic policies, and a few narratives, etc., not very big, but right now at the stage of signaling, if we can do that, I think things would be, China will get the message. And the idea is that China should change. And unless the Communist Party in China changes, and not through regime change by doing kind of regime change that they have done in Eurasia, not those kind of regime change, but engaging China, and I think eroding the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Actually, this is what won the West the first Cold War. Because after the Helsinki Accords, etc., there was a greater engagement between the West and the Soviet Union, and a lot of these people came out and they started telling you about the Soviet Union. And I think when people begin to see that there is something, how repressive the regime is, and things will begin to happen. But this will require a very long strategy. And to say that it will happen in 10, 20, 15, 20, 50 years is not. I think the long game has to be played by the West. And somehow I think the West is not ready to yet play a long game because they have not taken a civilizational approach to dealing with China. So I'll stop here. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Ambassador Gupta. I think those were very detailed remarks on the book. So thank you again. With this, I now invite Professor Harsh Pant for making an intervention. What do you, Harsh?
Thank you, Manish, for having me, and thank you, Aaron, for writing this book and for being part of this discussion today. I think one of the challenges after at the very end is to say something new and interesting, which is very difficult now. But what I'll, first of all, let me mention the fact that those of us who are students here of international relations, we have learned so much from Aaron's work over the years, and he has been a great support to youngsters like myself when I was young. So he was very, very warm and always very professional in guiding us in terms of our work. And one of the things that I think emerges from not only from this book, but from the intellectual arc of Aaron's journey, is that there is a conceptual clarity that you find in his works that is I think quite striking, and what is very in some ways one almost feel jealous about the arc is the sense that you get from one book to the next. He could make a connection and almost very seamlessly you move from his first from his previous book to the next, and where he not only takes the academic conversation forward, but I think also the policy debates forward. And that I think in some ways has been one of the more striking things about this book, is that if you are to look at this debate between liberals and realists, etc., I think this debate, this book, continues that tradition, but making it amply clear in some ways that that the liberal high point of early 1990s, what kind of an impact it had on policy making, and how it shaped the contours of not only American foreign policy more broadly, but in this case America's China policy. And when he for example points out that what was the basic argument about the engagement, this idea of the growth of middle class, liberal ideas, strengthening of the rule of law, institutions of civil society, there's the sense that engagement would therefore lead to a certain set of outcomes. And this, as a student of international relations, this is IR 101, that you saw, this debate between realists and the liberals, and then the ideas community. You had the whole set of spectrum of issues covered, and through one policy lens. So all the students of international relations should be reading this book very, very carefully, because it tells you how connected policy and theoretical work is, and that your theoretical model, that your theoretical approaches, and in a sense also can shape your policy priorities, and the impact of those policy priorities on real world issues is quite striking. And I think in this case, what happened to China, what happened to America's China policy comes out very, very categorically. So I think I would encourage all those who are studying IR, who are studying American foreign policy, to read it very carefully. And then essentially, I think that the point that has been made about that engagement didn't work, that it was this attempt to make Chinese Communist Party into something different didn't work, and therefore the result is that China remains a revisionist power. And what is also striking is that across the political spectrum, whether Republican administrations, Democratic administrations, at a certain point in time, both of them were committed to enhancing engagement. So even at the level of domestic politics, for example, there was a widespread consensus about Chinese policy in a sense. And therefore, Tiananmen didn't matter for Clinton administration. Human rights didn't matter. Even the imbalance in the economic ties didn't matter, because there was a larger ideological dynamic and shaping that policy response. And that is quite striking, because that in some ways comes to this issue of consequences. So certainly there were no political reforms in China. That's one set of consequence, and therefore that the result is that the Chinese Communist Party continues along the same trajectory. But what is also interesting is that lopsided economic arrangement, where the American Rust Belt was getting out of kilter in some ways, and there was no the employment situation getting weaker, the manufacturing base getting weaker. I think that lopsided economic relationship between China and the US, as it emerged over a period of time, has also generated this intense backlash against globalization today. So this is also very, very interesting in terms of the dynamic that we are studying today, in terms of what is happening to economic globalization, and why is it that it is getting such a bad rap across the world, and in particular in the US, where I think the debate on trade and economy is still out in the open. And this this also alerts you to some of the long-term consequences of the policy choices that policymakers make at critical juncture as they weave their policy responses. A few, I think conceptually, what is and there are some issues that I would raise here in terms of if you take a step back and think of this argument in terms of conceptual categories. What is striking is how there are two kinds of issues that are being juxtaposed, and I would really love to hear Aaron's response to this, because because ultimately the argument falls back on this sense that, look, the Leninist core of the Communist Party remains the guiding force. Now, and we know, for example, that there are others who have argued that, look, the fact that we are also surprised about Chinese behavior is itself a surprise. If you know great power politics, then you also know that great powers tend to respond in a certain way. So, which is an argument that is an argument that draws its resonance from the structural underpinnings of international relations. So where I think what I find interesting is that is it primarily the fact that Communist Party did not change, or is it that the Chinese idea of what kind of a power they were becoming and therefore responding to the imperatives of being a great power? How do you weigh them? How do you make that assessment? I think that's an interesting question, because that also would clarify some of these categories for those of us who study realism, perhaps, or who study classical versus structural realism, as to what is this? Is it a mix of both, or is it primarily the question lies with the Chinese Communist Party? And if that is the case, then we are looking at a distinct set of factors where not the structural underpinnings of a great power politics. The issue that is connected with this is that if we see the literature on, and which I think a lot of it is quoted in the book as well, that there is an enormous amount of literature on the domestic politics in China, that the kind of domestic debates that the Chinese Communist Party was having, that the kind of different groups that the Chinese Communist Party saw. Certainly there was a core, but there were other reformists as well, and their positioning, they're pushing the format, they're pushing the envelope, and they're pushing certain kinds of agenda, particularly in the realm of economic liberalization. Now, in terms of this sense that, look, Xi is not a departure from the previous, leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. How far can we take that argument? In the sense that we have seen, for example, since Deng, a series of leaders who have, in their own ways, shaped the engagement with the rest of the world. So, if foreign policy is as much about what others do to you, then it is also a question of, have these leaders responded to the bilateral pressures that they were feeling, that they were getting from the other side? Or is it simply a question that the Leninist core of the CCP was trying to hold on to its own? So I think, in some ways, this question is interesting and important, because there is a lot of focus now on, although I think very few people understand it, but what is happening within the Communist Party. And I think it just opening up that black box, which is very difficult, but I think it does allow a certain sense of the arc of the Chinese evolution on this question, which may be interesting and may give us some other inputs. The other is, here comes this book of Arvind, but there are still those who are talking a different language when it comes to China in the US. I think Ambassador Gupta was saying that was suggesting, America is that the West is still getting it wrong. But there is a sense, I mean, like all good democracies, you have a contestation still going on. So, some have pitted, for example, Aaron's book with Bergston's book, right? C. Fred Bergston, who looks at the economic argument of China-US engagement. And he still talks of a G2, that there is a possibility that China and the US can come together and govern the global, at least the global economic framework. So those of us who have been following American foreign policy vis-a-vis India, we still recall this idea of G2 was floated in the early years of Obama administration. It really had a resonance in India at that particular point in time, with this, because it got linked to this question of, can America be trusted? You can become a partner of the US, but there are still those who believe in a G2. So now, when you see, even today, when you have people who are talking of G2 and who are questioning very, very openly whether economic decoupling, strategic decoupling with China is a possibility, and who are talking of cost and benefit analysis, and who are saying, well, what about the successes of US-China cooperation? Why have they not been included in this assessment? That there are certainly those areas during the at least 3 decades where US-China cooperation lend certain stability to the global economic order. Given the kind of disruption we are facing, can we just go back to that? And can a G2 perhaps help us in moving towards that. So I think that element is something that perhaps Aaron can talk about in his comments and examine a bit more. The other issue, which Ambassador Gupta also raised, is this question of post-Ukraine, the Russia-China axis. And I think this question of classical balance of power, that why is it that if Kissinger could do it in 1970s, Americans have found it very difficult. Maybe Kissinger is still there and talking about China today, that makes it difficult. But certainly the balance of power disruption of the 1970s, which allowed a certain kind of a structural argument to emerge. But today you don't see that. You don't see even an effort in that direction. You don't even see an articulation from someone that, there are arguments here and there. But in terms of the core of American strategic community, this argument of breaking up Russia-China axis is something that no one takes seriously. And here in India, there is a great degree of discomfort with that. So perhaps Aaron can talk about why that's the case and why that might be why this issue takes this kind of a salience that it does. I think the final two issues that I want to raise is on economics, because ultimately geoeconomics is becoming very, very vital for geopolitics today. And if you look at the kind of resources that are being put in the Indo-Pacific in terms of economics, the kind of the blocks that are coming up on economic liberalization, on economic convergence. So how do we reconcile the economic aspect and the strategic and security aspect when it comes to China, when it comes to America's China policy? I think ultimately a lot will hinge on that assessment, because a lot of the smaller countries, whether in Southeast Asia or in the wider Indo-Pacific, they still continue to see this binary between America as a more reliable strategic partner, but China continues to dominate the economic discourse. So how feasible it is to bring like-minded countries together on economics, or how feasible it is to build what you call an economic alliance in the contemporary sense, because that alliance certainly has different connotations for different constituencies, and it's very difficult at this point to see how that emerges. Now, finally, I would, given that the book talks a lot, the book is about getting China wrong, and I think the argument that you make is consensus between Democrats and the Republicans. You also then come to Trump. I just had one very simple question, and this is an open question, and I would really love to hear from you. What would a reassessment of China, would this kind of a reassessment would this have been possible in the absence of someone as disruptive as Trump? Because Trump generates a lot of different emotions, but I think on China, what he could do was something that very few leaders were willing to acknowledge and reconcile. So perhaps someone out of the mainstream comes into American politics and he shakes things up a bit on China. He does it on a number of other issues as well. But I think on this particular issue, where there was such a degree of consensus on engagement, would this have been possible without Trump? And I think that's an interesting hypothetical to think about, because we have seen a number of the changes that we have seen and Biden administration continuing on a lot of things that you talk about, and then that Trump also articulated in some ways vis-a-vis China. And now, I would just end by saying, by raising the point that Ambassador Gupta made about democracies and how is democracy versus non-democracy the best possible frame to look at the China challenge and to manage the China challenge, or is there a different frame? Because I think, as has been articulated, there are a number of issues with this frame, with this framing. So will the West or will the US be doing full justice to its China policy by looking at it through a certain frame like democracies versus non-democracies? Or is there an alternative frame available that one can tap into? If not, is there a need for an alternative frame? And I think Ambassador Gupta has made that point about the need for that kind of a frame. I would also end by saying that, look, in the end, America is not alone in getting China wrong. Everyone seems to have got China wrong, and we are still counting the costs of getting China wrong. Even in India, although Ambassador Gupta mentioned the fact that, look, we have a long history, but even that phase where we started building on our relationship with China, I think there were many things we could have done better. But there was a strong consensus within India as well that we have to manage our relationship, and we were the weaker party. I think that the difference with America is that America was the stronger party and then emerged, as you point out, is on the verge of becoming the weaker party. In India's case, India had to balance out its border, its presence at the neighbor, and the material disparity between India and China. But I think the bigger question for all like-minded countries remains the one that you have framed, is now that we acknowledge that we have got China wrong, what perhaps is the way forward? And are there challenges in the way that you have outlined, a number of issues that you have outlined? What challenges are there in terms of making that an operational reality? So thank you, Arvind, once again for this wonderful book, and thank you, Manish, for having me as part of this discussion.
Thanks, Harsh, as always, very illuminating remarks. So with this, maybe Professor Friedberg, would you like to respond to both the observations, and then we open it up for very briefly for just a couple of questions. So maybe over to you, Professor Friedberg.
Thank you very much. How much time do we have? How long would you like to go? These are large and important questions.
We can have another 15 minutes if that's fine.
Okay. All right. So let me very briefly try to address a number of the issues that have been raised, and there's so many of them, and they're so fundamental that I won't do justice to the comments that were offered, but let me try. First, Ambassador and also Harsh Pant, I think, raised a similar question about why exactly the United States or the West got things so wrong. And Harsh asked, could this change have happened without Trump? I mean, the answer to why so wrong is multi-layered, and it is something that I try to discuss in the book. It doesn't have a single cause. It's a convergence of many different things. And as I said, there's a certain naivete, there's a certain amount of greed or economic optimism, and there also is a kind of ideological belief in the way the world works and in the inevitability of movement towards greater freedom. And after all, this policy was put into place initially right in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the period when people were talking seriously about the end of history, when it was assumed that democracy, liberal democracy, were spreading across the planet and were unstoppable. So it's not that hard to understand why people initially had this view. I think, and I characterize it in the book in this way, that the policy of engagement was not an obvious blunder from the start, but it was a gamble. And the problem was not so much taking the risk or taking the gamble, but continuing to double down on that initial bet without hedging adequately and not paying enough attention to the accumulating evidence that the bet wasn't paying off. And why that happened is also important and complicated. I do think Trump played a role. Trump was the accelerant, I think, to a tendency or a trend that was already beginning to get started in the United States, a growing dissatisfaction with various elements of Chinese policy that were accumulating and had been accumulating really since, I would say, since the turn of the century. US policy would have started to shift, I think had started to shift somewhat towards a more competitive posture towards China, but there's no doubt that Trump accelerated that process. And one indication of that and of its significance is the extent to which the policies of the current administration, the Biden administration, continue in many respects, most respects, the elements of the policy that were put into place under Trump. So I think there's an emerging consensus in the United States about the significance of this problem, differences over exactly how to deal with it. But there's no doubt that Trump accelerated the process. Of course, Xi Jinping is the really critical player. I think if China had continued to take a sort of hide and bide, a more cautious, low-key approach over the last 10 years or so, our response would still be lagging. It is not where it needs to be, and it's getting there, but it's taken a lot to get us to that point. I think both of you have raised this question about what is the best framework for thinking about a strategy for responding to China and the growth of China's power and the challenge that that poses. And I think for the United States, it is always the case that the ideological element will be important. There's no getting away from it. We are an ideological country. We are not a pure realist state, and we're never going to be. So purely for purposes of mobilizing domestic support, I think it's necessary to point out the character of the Chinese regime and the ways in which what it does to its own people and what it would do if it were dominant over others are counter to the beliefs on which, of course, not only the United States is founded, but other democratic societies as well. That said, there's also always a realist element in American policy. Since the United States has become a great power, we talk a lot about principles, but we're perfectly capable and under the right circumstances of cutting deals and cooperating with powers that perhaps don't live up to our standards ideologically. And I think we're going to have to do that. Specifically on the question of breaking Russia and China apart, I do think that's something which would be desirable in the long run. I don't think it's going to be possible, certainly not as long as Mr. Putin is in power. And that's not because of the ideological blindness of the United States or the West, but of the aggressiveness and brutality of the Putin regime. There's no way that we were going to acquiesce in what he's done in Ukraine. We had no choice, I think, but to resist that. But in the long run, I do think that China and Russia are not natural partners. And at this point, the disparity in power between them is very great. I think the Russians have an underlying anxiety about that. I wouldn't rule out the possibility in the long run of pulling Russia towards the West and splitting it from China, but that isn't going to happen anytime soon. I guess I would say coming back to this question of the ideological principle, from a perspective of the United States, I think first we have to mobilize domestic support. I mentioned that I think the values piece of this is important for that purpose. We also have to strengthen our relations with our longstanding treaty allies, and those have always been based in part on shared values. So I think we're in the process of trying to rebuild, if you like, a bloc. But there is also going to be, and that bloc is going to have at its core liberal democracies. There is also clearly going to be an authoritarian bloc that consists of China, Russia, maybe some smaller powers around it. And then there's going to be everybody else, and including the countries of the global South in particular. And there is going to be a competition, I think, over the alignment of those powers. China clearly sees the global South as a potential source of power for itself or leverage for itself, a way of counterbalancing the superior power of the United States in the West. And I think the Western countries have for a long time ignored or not paid sufficient attention to what was going on in the global South. And that's starting to change. We're going to be spending more money, we're going to be paying more attention and so on, motivated by concerns over China. And I don't think that can be cast in purely ideological terms, certainly not with the United States or other countries going on and lecturing everyone how they should have similar systems to ours. However, I insist that this is a struggle between opposing systems. The Chinese see it that way. I think we have to see it that way as well. There are many differences between democratic countries and how they organize their politics, but they have certain common agreed principles regarding the sanctity of the individual, the rule of law, self-governance. Those are major differences between us and them, and we can't ignore them or underplay them. Last, I think on this issue of a civilizational basis, I mean, if we're asking, what is the framework? If it's not an ideological framework, and it's not going to be a purely realist framework, could it be a civilizational framework? We can talk perhaps about what that means. I'm very skeptical of that, in part because I see in this country people who advocate a civilizational conception of American policy have a very particular view of what that means. And it's, we're going to be aligned with white Christian countries, and we don't really care about anybody else. So a civilizational policy from the perspective of the United States would be something which I would be strongly opposed to, and which I think would weaken our position with relation to China. So I realize I haven't addressed most of the questions, but those are some first thoughts.
Fascinating, Professor Friedberg. For the paucity of time, can we combine a couple of questions and then maybe you could respond? Yeah, so let me begin. And in fact, I do have a question, and then we have a couple of others. So Professor Friedberg, I was also wondering, we were talking about the strategic divergence between US and China for obviously realist reasons, ideological reasons, but can you identify areas or two where you see the US and China still have some sort of a convergence? So I think even that will also be, I mean, if you can just reflect on that. So with this, I now ask, maybe we can start with Kalpit. So Kalpit, please introduce yourself and please be extremely brief as possible.
Yes, thank you so much, Manish. I'm Kalpit from Observer Research Foundation. And my question to Professor Friedman is that, see, in the Trump era, we had a lot of, there was a lot of focus on zeroing in on the origins of the COVID-19 investigation as to where did it originate really. And currently, would it be a fair assessment to say that, under the Biden administration, that it is kind of not picked up that kind of steam, or it's been relegated to the back burner? Thank you.
Thanks, Kalpit. Professor Ayushi Ketkar.
Thank you, Manish. Am I audible?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. There was a lot of food for thought there in this webinar. Thank you so much to all the experts. I would like to, I'm Ayushi from JNU, and I would want the experts to come in, especially Arvind, to, we have this talk about a systemic problem, and even Professor Pant mentioned about structural realism. So my question to you is just two quick things. One is, what is the role of, or how, I would like your comment on the role of leadership and narrative in this entire exercise? Because is it a sine qua non for every leader to rise, to have an anti-West stance? Because you see this a common feature right from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping. So do you see this as something which is necessary in China? It's a systemic problem that if you have to rise, then you have to take an anti-Western stance. Secondly, also the role of narrative in this entire exercise, because we see in international relations, there is an increase, especially ever since the emergence of social media, that narratives play a very important role. So this entire narrative of China, whether it's their grand narrative, Tianxia, which means all under heaven, or whether it's their, century of humiliation. So these narratives play a very important role in inculcating and nurturing an anti-Western stance. And second, going from your own now remark, where you said that US, it's pretty oxymoron when you say US values ideology and at the same time realism or realpolitik is important. So do you see this inconsistency between ideology or ideals on one side and realpolitik or realism, extreme realism, as you would say, on the other side, emboldening China because it sees that West, especially the US, cannot counter it in any way? So is that why China is not even willing to change or make amends? So I would like your response to this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ayushi. The last question from Dr. Kushnam, who is joining from Bangalore.
Good evening, everyone. And this is Dr. Kushnam from Bangalore. My question is very simple, and with the realization that US has already got China wrong, so what should be the pragmatic policy and the approach of US so far as the policy towards its policy on Taiwan, given the escalating tension in the after the visit of Nancy Pelosi and the China's response? Basically, in the recently, the Chinese foreign minister has said that any interference from any corner will be crushed by the wheels of history. In this scenario, what should be the exact or the pragmatic and the practical policy and the approach of US towards the Taiwan policy? And basically in the context that India's interest is not there in any of the hot conflict in the region. Thank you. Your response, please.
Thank you, Doctor. Over to you, Professor Friedberg.
Okay, thank you. Again, wonderful questions. We could talk about any one of them for hours, but let me very quickly try to give responses. Manish, first your question about convergence. I do think there are areas where the interests of the United States and China converge or ought to converge. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will or that their policies will. They both have an interest in the avoidance of major war. That's still true, and that's still important. People have said for many years that they share an interest in addressing various global problems, communicable disease, climate change, and so on. That is also true. I think on communicable disease, the cooperation in that domain has been set back by the way in which the CCP regime handled COVID-19 and the mistrust that has spawned. Climate change, the Biden administration has tried to take the view that we can separate out issues where we're going to be competing and not getting along and not agreeing, and those where we have an interest in cooperation, and climate change for them is right front and center. The response of the Chinese side has been to say, no, everything is all one. If we're having problems on one issue, we're not going to cooperate on climate change. I think that's a bluff. The Chinese regime has its own very strong interest in dealing with climate change. It would certainly prefer that more of the cost of that be borne by the Western advanced countries than China, but they're not going to stop cooperating on climate change because they disagree with us on Taiwan. On the question of COVID and whether the Biden administration has put it to the back burner, I don't think it's entirely the case, because I think there have been some ongoing investigations and some continuing efforts to get international institutions to continue to look at this, but certainly they have not put it front and center in the way that the Trump administration did. I think the feeling is that this is unresolvable in the end, and there's a desire, I think, to focus attention on other things. But it's a major issue. I think the Chinese regime can't get away from it. Whatever they did, whatever their responsibility for the outbreak of the pandemic, their handling of it, both in the initial stages and in their attempt to use their position as a dominant producer of personal protective equipment and so on to extract concessions from other governments, is one of the reasons why attitudes about China have turned so negative throughout the democratic world. Pew just published polls last week that show this very sharp increase in negative attitudes towards China across the world, basically, in most democratic countries. And it starts in 2020 in most cases. So they're paying a price for that. The questions about leadership and whether it's necessary for CCP leaders to adopt an anti-Western stance. Of course, for a while, the CCP leaders downplayed the anti-Western element of their ideology because they wanted to cooperate. They felt relatively weak. I don't think it's inevitable that any Chinese leader would have to adopt an anti-Western stance, but I do think for the Chinese Communist Party, which is constantly concerned about its grip on power, its legitimacy, its popular support, being in opposition to the West is useful, or they've decided that it's useful as a way of mobilizing domestic political support and sustaining it. And these narratives that you mentioned are important. They have a variety of roles, but they're important domestically, I think, to explain or to argue to the Chinese people why it is that the CCP is pursuing the repressive policies that it is, or why it is that it's having friction with Western powers. They have a story to tell, and they put a lot of emphasis on it. They've also, I think, placed more emphasis than in the past on trying to shape narratives that will be accepted in other parts of the world, especially in the global South. This idea of discursive struggle is very central to the thinking of Chinese strategists. I think we need to pay attention to it because they have a story that they're telling now about the decline of the West, the failure of democratic societies, the triumph of authoritarianism, and so on. And it needs to be challenged. Finally, on Taiwan, the pragmatic policy on Taiwan, I think the policy that the United States and other countries have been pursuing is basically the right one, which is to say, providing support for Taiwan so that it can strengthen its own defenses. And Taiwan plays the greatest role and has, of course, the most responsibility for doing that. For the United States and other countries in the region to strengthen their military capabilities so as to try to deter China from ever thinking of using force to resolve the Taiwan question. But also, and this goes beyond Asia, making clear to the Chinese leaders that if they were to do this, they would face enormous economic consequences as well as potentially military consequences. We're, in a sense, playing for time, hoping that if we can deter the Chinese leadership from using force, that over time, perhaps its views on the Taiwan issue will mellow and it can be resolved in some peaceful way. That's going to be difficult because the CCP leadership, certainly under Xi Jinping, has placed this issue at the center of its domestic narrative and also is kind of turning up the heat, I think, in order to try to intimidate not only people on Taiwan, but people in the West. I don't happen to believe that we should abandon the one China policy and endorse Taiwan independence. I don't think most people on Taiwan want that because they know that it would greatly increase the risk of war. I don't think it helps deter conflict. On the other hand, I don't think we should sell out Taiwan. I mean, there's going back to the frameworks, the purely realist position on this might very well be we shouldn't be risking war of 28 million people. It doesn't make sense. This is in China's sphere of influence. We really need to back off and let them take control of it. The reasons why we're not doing that are many, but I would argue that one of them, and in this country, I think it's an extremely important one, is that people are reluctant, unwilling to allow a big, strong authoritarian power to crush a relatively small, relatively weak democracy, even if we don't have an alliance with them. And that's the lesson to me of the way in which the United States and other Western countries have handled the conflict in Ukraine. It's at least in that sense, a similar situation. So those are very quick answers.
Oh, extremely fascinating. We just before we close, Ambassador Arvind Gupta has raised his hand, so maybe he can make some brief observation.
I'm sorry to come in, but I thought I'll just make a short remark about this civilization. Actually, this is more a question to our Indian friends, academics, students, professors who are all here. My question is that all our analysis of the geopolitical situation, the world is essentially the framework which has been laid out in IR, which is liberalism, international realism, liberalism, and structural realism, etc. But don't you see that this framework is highly deficient in either explaining today's world or making any policies which are effective? So that's one question that you need to look at. Because as Aaron Friedberg has argued, you follow the old principles and you get the same results. He said it in a different context, but that is what it is. So do we require some new thinking? The new thinking is the civilizational bit that I talked about. And of course, Aaron said that it is very difficult to sell this idea in the US because there the idea of civilization is white Christian civilization. And I agree. I think, but can we expand our horizons and look at that framework which was given by Huntington, which was more in nature of clash. But I think you could reverse it and see whether some cooperation is also possible. The reason why I'm saying so is, how does India think about itself? It is a civilizational state, and the new researches are showing that how underplayed India's place in the world has been, how our worldview was never taken. I mean, this is new academic research is showing, whether it is in the field of archaeology, whether it is, we're talking about the old connective visions, connections, the roots and so on, the spread of ideas much before even Christianity or Islam made an appearance in the world. So we have to think, there is no other way. I mean, we can force ourselves to think in terms of post-colonial or post-colonial categories, but that is not going to take us very far. It is coming naturally to us. And we can say that Indian civilization, unlike some other civilization, has been an inclusive civilization, where so many ideas, thoughts, etc. have grown. So I think our thinkers and the new strategists and policy planners that we are now, they are growing in GNU and other places, I think have to start thinking about whether there can be some contribution to this, the international discourse. And I think that's where perhaps the American strategic thinkers who are very good at strategic thinking, but not necessarily that applies to the politics, unfortunately, but they can have a dialogue with the Indian thinkers and Indian strategists as to whether there is a possibility of building a new narrative and a new framework. Because the way our commons are stressed, the way so many other problems have grown, there is no solution to that in your traditional IR. I think this is recognized. But still there is this strange reluctance to expand our thinking. So that's the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gupta. And with this, I think let's bring this session to a close. So obviously, thank you, Professor Friedberg, for joining us. And we are actually looking forward to more such conversations ahead in the near future. Ambassador Arvind Gupta, Harsh Pant, and all others who have joined us here on Zoom, but also on our YouTube channel. So a big thanks to each one of you. And we look forward to more such conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.